everyone. Welcome to Sherloc's Roundtable. I am Julianna RC.
And I'm RC Williams.
And today we're going to be talking about what's going on with the Randall Crater case, the FTX case, and the CBDC. What is the connections, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you've been following us with Sherloc's expose, we've been talking about what's going on with Randall Crater. But if you're a layperson like me, right, you can read through everything, but sometimes it's not really connecting. So I asked RC if he can spend some time and talk to me about what's actually happening, because there's some of the behind the scenes stuff that I don't understand. So I wanted to learn. And I thought that I wasn't the only one that really wanted to say, hey, what does this all mean for me? Right. So we're going to have that conversation today.
Yeah, because we've talked about it a lot, but the thing we haven't done is really break it down in the way that Sherloc breaks it down.
Correct.
All right.
You know, so I like the fact that you really understand this space, right? Mm-hmm. So that you can explain what does this all really mean.
All right. So why don't we jump in? How about we start with the Randall Crater case?
Cool.
Guys, so we're going to have some fun with you today. What we're going to do is we're going to share the screen and actually show you what we're talking about. A lot of times when we do the show, we just talk about something, but we thought it'd be a good idea to go ahead and share the screen with you. So we're going to do that now. Dun, 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 dun. Dun, 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 dun. All right, and then let's expand that out so we can see what's going on here.
Right on.
So, Julianna, you asked to start with the Randall Crater case. Let me scroll back to the top, and then I'll go back down to that diagram. So, our publication, SherlocExposes.com, really took this case and ran with it because the implications for cryptocurrency are huge. Randall Crater is a successful technology entrepreneur, built a technology for a cryptocurrency called MyBitcoin, licensed it to a gentleman named John Roche. We'll get to that connection in a second. He was the CEO of MyBitcoin, and then he eventually sold it to him. So what ended up happening is the government believed that MyBitcoin was a scam. It didn't believe it was a real cryptocurrency or that it was backed with gold or anything like that. Now, when this all came down, and the feds decided to start handing out subpoenas, Randall was named as a defendant along with John Roche and a couple of other people involved with this case. And they ended up falling off, just magically disappearing. And Randall Crater was the only one left.
Awesome. Okay.
So what's interesting is the reason that he was the only one left.
So can I say this to you? Ready? Okay. Sure. So as a kinesthetic learner, you went through that entire story, right? But for me to really understand it, I really need the chart. So can we go from the chart so we can look at, you know, who the players are?
Absolutely.
And, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
So let's scroll down and let's take a look at the tail of the tape, as we like to call it, right? So we actually started here with a chart to connect the dots. So MyBitcoin is the cryptocurrency in question.
Right.
This is the company that, in essence, created the cryptocurrency that the federal government said isn't real, isn't backed by gold, so on and so forth, right? So when you look at the players in the game, we had talked about Randall Crater, so we have him over here. He was the founder of Grayshore Technologies. They actually created and then licensed the technology that powered MyBitcoin.
So he actually built MyBitcoin. He's the technologist behind it.
He built the technology,
okay,
yes.
Cool.
Then he licensed it to a gentleman named John Roche. So John Roche is the owner and CEO, or was, of MyBitcoin.
And he's the brain power behind this design and everything that we're looking at here.
Right. So the company that ultimately became MyBitcoin was one that John Roche owned. Okay. John Roche is also an heir to the Disney fortune. He's considered the black sheep of the family. Take that as you will, but he's considered kind of the outcast.
Okay.
Still gets the money, but not necessarily favored by the family.
Okay.
Okay. So as you can see here, when we laid out the diagram, we wanted to talk about each part that the players had. So John Roche, in testimony and in deposition, told the government that he owned MyBitcoin.
Okay.
And this is really important, right? He said, listen, he designed and controlled the MyBitcoin site, all of the social media, everything like that. What ended up happening is that his illegal conduct ended up being ignored by the federal government. In essence, he started in a position where it's like, well, this guy's a CEO. He's obviously responsible to the CFTC, the government agency, basically wrote an affidavit for him.
So they were just ignoring the fact that he was doing all this illegal stuff.
Correct.
So, I mean, could you think about it? Maybe they were complicit with it and they were allowing him to go through all of that?
It's a great question. So ultimately what we found is that all things point to that being the case. And what we're still trying to get to the root of is exactly what.
So I don't want to jump ahead to FTX. Let's go to Bill Donahue next.
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that John Roche and Billy Donahue were longtime friends.
Okay.
Here's the reason why. They had worked on other businesses together. Billy Donahue is a CEO and owner of a company called Harmony International. So the unique thing about My Bitcoin is that it was going to be backed by hundreds of millions of dollars in gold. Well, Billy Donahue was the guy that was going to make that happen. He said, look, I've got access to gold that can back my Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. This is going to be the greatest thing ever. It's going to be the first one that's ever come in the world and everything. I got it covered.
So as a side note, when we went through Randall's case, they talked about how Randall was part of this, but it's Billy who had come up with the documentation saying that the crypto was going to be backed by the gold that
Correct.
Randall thought that he was building the technology for.
That is correct.
Like, wow.
Yeah. So it turns out that Billy Donahue forged those documents.
Yikes.
He had everyone believing it to the point where Randall Crater, in this case, actually paid over $100,000 for legal paperwork to, of all things, here's the strange irony, ensure that the gold backing was in place for my Bitcoin.
So he had invested in the surety of what's going on with the entire system. He obviously was very excited about the entire system. And somehow we've got John Roche and Billy, and end of the story is nothing really happened to them, but you'll get into more details as far as that's concerned.
Correct.
But the one holding the bag was Randall.
Right. And the reason it turns out that the federal government decided to go after Randall Crater is because he chose to fight. As a successful entrepreneur, Randall had the means to defend himself. And he said, listen, if I did something wrong, then I did something wrong and you should throw the book at me. But I haven't done any of the things that you said here.
So I want to make a note for the audience that the federal government and a judicial system would use one case to go after the second case, to go after the next case. And Randall was in a line of 4 or 5 other cases where they were found guilty. They weren't able to fight the case, right? And Randall said, no, and fought back and said, I have the means to be able to do this. And then when we found out about what Randall was going through, all we kept thinking was, oh my gosh, if they get to Randall, then we're next. And meanwhile, P.S., CBDC was coming out, all these things where, we're hearing things that are happening and we're going, wait a minute, there's a tie back directly to this Randall Crater case. So go ahead.
Right. So one of the reasons that we chose to take on this case is because we understood the implications for cryptocurrency as a whole. This case is what's considered a bellwether, which is what you just described. It will set precedents for cases going forward. And when whistleblowers started to share documents with us and actually came on record and started having these discussions, we're like, just give us everything you have. And so we made a decision early on that every piece of evidence that was given to us, we were just going to link to. So if you go to Sherloc Exposes and you actually read the different pieces, you'll see that we link to a ton of documents because we want everyone to see what we saw. Because as you put the pieces together, you begin to see that everything that the government, and when we talk about the government, we talk about the alphabet agencies. So there were multiple of them here. The DOJ was involved, the Department of Justice, the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Justice, right, DOJ, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. That one's really important because the government in this case saw an opportunity to place the CFTC in charge of regulating cryptocurrency. Now, this is going to tie to FTX a bit later, but what the CFTC and the government in a larger scope really want to do is they want to pick winners and losers in the cryptocurrency industry.
So as a lay person, my takeaway is we've got a few people at the very top with the money and the power manipulating all these agencies to conspire together to garnish an end result that benefits them.
Correct.
Okay.
And so as we dug in, and Michael Kruger, you'll see him down here. He's kind of towards the bottom here, but he's really important. And he went on the record and did an hour interview with us as a whistleblower. Not only did the government agencies threaten him extensively, but Michael Kruger helped us understand just how much the government hates competition, right? And one of the reasons that they wanted to snuff out My Big Coin is because it's something they wanted to do. And
competition.
Randall's creation jumped the gun on that and put the government in a very strange place where it's like, well, wait a minute, we can't, somebody's already done it, free market, we're in trouble here, right? And if you listen to that interview, you hear all sorts of interesting things about how the FBI in particular does business. But Michael Kruger also helped us understand that the CFTC used this case in large part to go to congressional committees.
Here we go.
To secure hundreds of millions of
our
dollars of taxpayer dollars in funding for their agency.
So add to everything I said before, the fact that they're using our money and weaponizing our money to do what they want to do to be able to control us.
Correct.
So every American should be very upset right now.
Every American should be very upset because this, as we peel back the layers of the onion in this case, you get to see what the government does as regular practice. Like this case is unique, but the style and system of how the government does things is not.
Correct.
They've been doing this forever, and we have an instance here where we just happen to catch them colluding in order to get it done.
Well, this is going to bring in things that is basically, behavioral modification,
Correct.
AKA, a digital type of slavery where, if they say, we don't want you to be able to go a mile from your house, they can actually cut off your monies. And, if you're eating too much, they can cut off your food supplies. And
well, we're going to come to that a bit later. We're going to walk people through what the world being governed by a central bank digital currency would look like for the average person. And it's pretty scary. But this case says a lot about where the government is at and ultimately how many of them are involved.
Well, if you got Randall that's still, fighting for his freedom at this point,
right?
But John Roche and Billy Donahue is just, put loose and fancy free. That just goes to show you.
And interestingly enough, how John Roche ended up being pushed out of the equation, just disappeared. Just into thin air, is that one of the lead attorneys for the CFTC went to him and said, listen, we need your computer and your files for evidence. And he used the ever famous, well, the dog ate my homework. He said his girlfriend destroyed his computer. He could not provide the documentation. This attorney basically wrote him an affidavit to that effect. And shortly after that, John Roche just kind of disappeared from the case. You're probably thinking the same thing we're thinking right now. How does that happen?
Intentionally.
Well, when you're complicit and you do what the government wants you to do, which you'll see more here in a bit, those are some of the fringe benefits that go along with it, right? A guy like Randall Crater decides to fight and says, I'm gonna fight this thing all the way. And they said, well, we're gonna make an example out of you. So now we get a double win. We get a bellwether case and we get to make an example out of you. Why is all of that important? Because cryptocurrency in its purest form is decentralized, which means it doesn't need a bank or the government in between, right? And it's peer-to-peer. So if you and I want to do a transaction, I see value, you see value, we can do that, and Uncle Sugar doesn't get his cut.
Well, that's a problem.
That's always a problem.
Big problem.
Government hates competition.
So do you think that once upon a time, the government really thought that they could stop the whole crypto situation and it wouldn't supersede their fiat currency? And finally they were like, oh no, we need to jump in quick and, try to garnish control because they didn't really think that it was going to take off the way that it did.
I do. I think that the government, and historically the government of the United States has done this, is they either underestimate or they're so late to the table on things. They say, oh, that's nothing to worry about. Come on, that's just crazy. And then before you know it, they're like, oh no, we've got to catch up with that. A more classic example of that one quickly is antitrust. So antitrust legislation was set up to protect the American consumer from monopolies. So no one company could control an industry and force pricing on you and only give you one choice, right? That basically hinders a vibrant economy. So legislation was passed in the early 1900s, in essence, to curb that. One of the first people they got was John Rockefeller, the chairman of Standard Oil. So they said, we're going to get this guy. He's got a monopoly. We're going to take him to the cleaners. So here's what happened, right? They talk about the road to hell being paved with good intentions.
Mhm.
So they break up Standard Oil. John Rockefeller has his empire broken up into smaller pieces, which he owns controlling interests of. By breaking up Standard Oil, the US government made John Rockefeller infinitely richer because some of those companies that broke off, Exxon, Chevron, BP. When's the last time you saw Standard Oil? No, you haven't, right? But you see an Exxon,
All
a
the other ones.
Chevron, and a BP. It made him infinitely richer. This is what the government's really bad at, right? So it's like, oh, we got it, except we don't have it. They didn't account for that. And this is another case with crypto where they're late to the table and then they're going to try to do something about it. And they're like, wait, we should control it because we have a whole nother agenda that we need to get through. So let's use it.
But their agenda included the SWIFT banking system so that they had that middleman where, and they're a digitalized dollar. Is that what it's called?
So
versus, it's not a crypto. It's
correct. Correct. So the SWIFT banking system is that's connected to the Bank of International Settlements. So in order for you to send a wire or payment somewhere else in the world, to say from the United States to even Canada, you would use the SWIFT banking system. So that handles international back and forth.
But with crypto, you wouldn't need that.
Correct. With crypto, since it is decentralized, doesn't need a centralized exchange, peer-to-peer, you can do it with anyone in the world. If you have a wallet and they have a wallet and you're both willing to accept the means of exchange, i.e. Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? Some of the names that people know, you can do that.
So the only reason why the federal government wants SWIFT in the middle of all of this is so that they can control the money going back and forth because they're the middle person, right?
Right. So imagine that you're running SWIFT. So you're the Bank of International Settlements.
Tell them what they did to Russia.
Right. Well, so think about it like this. If you're the Bank of International Settlements, forever, you've basically had control of every transaction around the world. If you're the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, you're basically controlling the economies of the world because when they get in trouble, you give them a loan so that you can own assets, right? In the case of Russia, it was very unique. So this isn't a pro or con Vladimir Putin conversation. This is a factual what happened. So in light of what was happening in Ukraine, governments of the world, including the United States, said, well, look, we're going to cut Russia off from the SWIFT banking system. Well, Vladimir Putin had planned and did three things exceedingly well. One, he got as much gold as he possibly could. We'll come back to that in a second. The second one is he got as much Bitcoin and crypto as he could. The third is he worked more closely with China because they have a payment settlement system that's not part of the SWIFT system.
Did they back their currency also with the gold? They tied their currency to it?
Right. So when we did our outlook for precious metals not too long ago, we talked about how in the third quarter of 2022, that like 400 tons of gold was gobbled up by central banks around the world. So the Central Bank of China, Central Bank of Russia, like they all were trying to get gold reserves. What does that tell you? That they're getting ready to back their currency with something tangible.
So I remember once upon a time that Russia and China were working together and they said, we'll start using each other's currency. Right. And our dollar is supposed to be backed by, petro, right? That's why it's called the petrodollar. So now we're not the leaders in oil, and we've got two countries that are, nixing using our dollar, and we've got 100 plus other countries that have nixed using our dollar. What then happens when you have nobody's using our dollar? SWIFT has now been kicked out of the.
So let's take a couple of steps back and then we'll come back around to that because the BRICS nations, which is what you're talking about, is really important, especially as we do this now. So Putin did these three things exceedingly well. He was prepared for what was going to come. They thought that they got the drop on him. And by they, I mean the different governments of the world that said he is a threat and we need to eliminate that. So when they cut Russia off of the SWIFT banking system, Vladimir Putin managed to move $450 billion through crypto, had gold and he basically backed the ruble, the country currency of Russia, with gold, and not only strengthened his relationship with the Chinese, but this goes back to the BRICS nations. So you've got Brazil, India, right, Russia, China, BRICS in essence, right? They said, well, look, this is proof we don't really need the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And so what happened? Saudi Arabia is upset with the United States. They say, hey, we want to join BRICS too. And then you've got other countries that want to join BRICS, right? Because there really isn't a need anymore. Hey, the US is an old dog in the fight. The petrodollar thing is about dead. I can do bad by myself, was the old adage, right? So they said, well, look, let's get together and work on this. So what was interesting is that Putin managed to weather that storm, and the ruble's value increased because it was backed by something tangible.
Yep.
The Chinese are working on the digital yuan, which is backed by gold, right? So they're already down the road with CBDCs. We'll get to that later. But Ukraine, the citizens of Ukraine were also prepared for a world where their systems were cut off. So with the conflict that was going on, your average Ukrainian citizen bought groceries or vehicles in cryptocurrency. So did it hurt that things changed? Yes, but they were prepared, and they used alternative currencies or alternative methods to continue sans whatever was going on. That should tell you a lot about what's going on with the world today and how prepared countries are for alternatives other than the United States being the lead dog.
Isn't it interesting that the Randall Crater case would be all in the mix of everything that's happening here? Like, this is not a United States issue. This is a worldwide issue that's about to happen. That is happening.
It is. And Crater's creation of the My Bitcoin technology scared the US government because that was a plan that they had. They had a completely different plan of what they were going to do.
Well, of course.
And he happened to beat them to the punch. And you know what? That's not going to happen. Uncle Sugar hates competition, right? But you see what's happening around the world. People are looking for alternatives to a system, generally speaking, because each country has a central bank, right? And the Bank of International Settlements and the International Monetary Fund, they're all there, right? But people are sensing that these things either A, are not stable, B, could come under a control that allows you less freedom with your assets, or C, just a complete shutdown in a world that looks like China with their social credit score. And people don't want that, so they look for alternatives.
Well, I think people are also waking up to the fact that our taxes don't go to our people. It goes to the IMF.
Right.
Like, why? Like, so that they can distribute our monies the way they want to? Like, when did we lose control over our land and what's happening here?
Sure. So, I mean, that's been a long time coming and happening. The World Bank, interesting name, the International Monetary Fund, also interesting name, have long worked together to control resources. So in our precious metals forecast, we talked about the coming resource war, right? Is money important? Absolutely. It's a method of exchange to get something that you want. But natural resources in the next decade are going to become the battle. And China was smart. We wrote about this back in 2015. We said China is going to buy up access to every natural asset that they can get their hands on, which is why they own so many of the mines in Africa and they own most of the shipping lanes and the ports, right? They knew what they wanted to do because they have like a 150-year plan, and they're not shy about it. You go find their plan. They'll tell you exactly what they're going to do. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund will loan money to countries, knowing that they can't pay it back, okay? And then they say, well, look, if you can't pay it back, refinance it. Then they go out and get investors who the collateral for them investing is if you can't pay your bill, we take over something that has value.
So, like what happened to us during the Civil War when we went from being a republic to being a corporation because the United States became the collateral when we needed the money to do what we needed to do. So in other words, they're still doing that today where the IMF will go into a country and go, y'all need some money, lend them the money, and then when the country can't repay, right, they take the entire country as their collateral.
You're right, and this most recently happened with Argentina. When Argentina's economy failed, vulture capitalists, guys like Paul Volcker, went in and said, well, look, yeah, we'll fund that. We'll finance that when Argentina couldn't pay its bill. And like, hey, look, we need some help here. They figured out, they're like, well, since you can't pay, we're going to take assets. We want your ports. We want this. We want that. And they took them to court. They took the world court is The Hague in the Netherlands. They took them all the way.
Mm-hmm.
And they won. The vulture capitalists won. That's the famous story of a Argentinian ship being in port overseas. They seized it because it was an asset. Now, it wouldn't have paid off the debt, but they were making an example out of them, saying, that's ours because you couldn't pay your bill.
So let's tie this back to what's happened with Randall Crater and FTX. Because FTX has kind of been the money laundering, so they can get the money and get what they want and call in their collateral.
Right. So let's go to the Sherloc Big Board here, as I like to call it. So we've got a couple of these up. I want to go to a piece that we originally did back on September 10th of this year called When Liars Conspire.
Mm-hmm.
So when we looked at this case, the short version of it is Gary Gensler, who is now the chairman of the SEC and was the former chairman of the CFTC, had basically colluded to make sure the CFTC had control over the cryptocurrency industry and could pick winners and losers. That part's really important.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened is, and the reason we covered this is that, and let me scroll down here, I want to get to the part that you're asking about. So the day after the verdict came down in the My Bitcoin case with Randall Crater, the next morning there was a feature story in Yahoo News about the CFTC taking a larger role in regulating cryptocurrency.
Mm-hmm.
One of the people quoted in that article was a huge Democrat, to some degree Republican backer, named Sam Bankman-Fried, who happened to be the CEO of the now failed FTX crypto exchange.
So you wrote about FTX before this whole big hoopla happened.
Correct.
Did you see that coming? Because you knew there was a potential of them money laundering through the crypto system, huh?
Right. And so normally you think to yourself, well, cryptocurrency is a dirty industry, right? Drug dealers, human trafficking, that's where that happens. What most people miss is that governments are involved in this as well. Mm-hmm. So here's where it gets really weird. When you peel back the layers of the onion of FTX, we said, well, there are some interesting connections here, not just timing, but actual connections between Gary Gensler. Now, mind you, he's the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. That means his job is to protect you from bad investments and to go after bad guys who scam. That's his job. CFTC, that was his job.
But meanwhile, he's the one who's actually doing it.
Meanwhile, he's deeply interconnected with Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX and the young lady who is the CEO of Alameda Research. And Gary Gensler used to work under that young lady's dad at MIT. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where all bad things around financial technology happened. The Boston Fed and the New York Fed are notorious for working with MIT on financial technology. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise. But what was interesting, though, is that all of this goes down with Sam Bankman-Fried, and it turns out to be this scam, yet what happens to him or doesn't happen to him is interesting. And then where he put his money. So let's see. He donated $40 million in counting to the Democratic Party in the United States, and some of that money went to Republicans, right? So all this money is being spread around. He's the second largest donor to Democrats behind George Soros, all of a sudden, right? And all of this is allowed to happen, even though prior to FTX collapsing, there were indicators that Sam Bankman-Fried was buying influence. The government brought him in to help write cryptocurrency legislation. Fancy that. So how does that happen? You got a 30-year-old kid who doesn't know his head from a hole in the ground. You got a bunch of young kids living in the Bahamas at some weird hippie commune, right? Basically running tens of billions of dollars in assets. So the next question you should ask yourself is, for who?
Or are they really able to do that and they're just the front people who are taking the fall?
Why do we believe that's true? Well, as it stands today, what's happened to Sam Bankman-Fried? He's still held up in the Bahamas. At least that's what we're led to believe. And people have said to us when we've done interviews, well, it's like he's going to jail. And it's like, don't be so sure, because it's very convenient that he had a large amount of freedom to do what he needed to do.
So I'm hoping, right, as an average citizen of the United States of America, that everybody that was involved in that situation, from Gary Gensler on up and around, right, that it all collapses on them so that they all go to jail. This whole thing is completely treasonous. What they've done to, stealing our vote away, I mean, the lies that have been happening, this is crimes against humanity at this point.
It gets worse. So in May of this year, FTX announced a partnership with the nation of Ukraine for a fund on war and recovery efforts. And when all of this happened with Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, they denied it existed until people started showing up with screenshots of it. So with Ukraine, and this is nothing against the citizens of Ukraine. These are strong, resilient people. They've been through hell and back just over the years, right? But the government of Ukraine is notoriously corrupt. Ukraine is a place where things go to get longer. Money, drugs, human trafficking, sex trafficking, all of these things run through Ukraine. So Ukraine, in the sense of FTX, was being used as a vehicle to move money around legally. And when it came back to politicians, people were like, oh man, the Democrats are funding the Democrats. This is some weird conspiracy cabal. Yes, but it's not just Democrats who are involved. We were one of the first to uncover an organization tied to Mitch McConnell, who is the Senate minority leader and happens to be a Republican, got money from FTX, right? It gets worse. If we scroll down here for a second, this is important to show you guys. Now, in this article, we go over a whole bunch of detail about how Congress works, and people jump from the public sector to the private sector. And basically, people who are in Congress write legislation to make sure they get money after they get out. And then when they go back, they write more. Okay. But what was interesting is that you had members of Congress writing bipartisan legislation. I want to make sure I find the names here. So let's see. I'll scroll stop and then we'll get there. So what was interesting is that John Boozman, who is a congressman from Arkansas, and Debbie Stabenow, who is a congresswoman from Michigan, in this article in Yahoo came out and said, well, we've created bipartisan legislation that would allow the CFTC to have oversight over cryptocurrency. Guess who they consulted with? Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX.
It's incestuous.
Guess who else got money from FTX?
Who?
John Boozman. People wonder why we've been so hot on him. It's like, because he's all over it. He took a leading role in creating bipartisan legislation to have the agency that's running this whole thing, like it's like racketeering. And RICO, if you want to get somebody on RICO, you can probably get the US government on RICO charges. And he's benefiting from it. He's doing what he's told. She's doing what she's told because that's what they do. Your government constantly does these things. And the Wall Street Journal actually wrote about this literally on the screen, right? So when you do that, it creates more job opportunities for officials who leave public service. For members of congressional committees that oversee such regulators, a new industry in their sandbox would create another stream of lobbyists and campaign donations.
Always follow the money.
We need to treat this seriously and take our responsibility seriously for protecting consumers.
So in conclusion, what I'm really hearing is that they're master magicians at storytelling.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's just like, here's a lie, believe this over here while they're doing this thing over there, right? Like, for example, people are like, oh, this is going to get us into war. And I'm like, Klaus Schwab said, we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Like, how come people are not hearing these types of things? Like, pretend everything's okay, but over here, everything's not okay.
In this revolution, it is you that will change.
Literally.
That's what Klaus Schwab says about the fourth industrial revolution. It's a change of you, how they change you, which is a
using
whole other story.
technology.
Which
Yeah,
is
we're
a
not going to go down
technology.
that whole path because that's a huge path in and of itself. But I want to stick with the cryptocurrency here.
So what you're seeing here is the United States is a representative form of government. It is
It's supposed to be,
It's supposed to be,
but it's not.
It is supposed to be a constitutional republic
But it's not.
where
Okay.
we elect people to represent us at a local level, a state level, and a federal level. That's the way it's supposed to work, and they're supposed to represent our interests.
Mhm.
Very quickly, when one gets to Washington D.C. and they get the meeting where it's explained to them how the system works, and then it's like, so what do you want to do?
Mhm.
Basically, you're going to do what we say, but what do you want to do? So you can get fat. This is why people go into Congress.
Mm.
You know, many of them broke or just average, and then they come out rich. Like, how do you enrich yourself in public service?
Mhm.
Get voted into Congress or the Senate. Then you'll become super rich, right? Congratulations. So you have people who come in and have an agenda or are handled by people like their donors
Mhm.
who have an agenda. And then magically legislation shows up. We've often talked about people who run for office
Mhm.
and lose. And many times what happens is you're told, okay, you're going to lose a couple of races, right? But when you do, there's going to be a job waiting for you, most likely at the place where you donate the remaining campaign funds, a nonprofit or some other organization. Magically, you get a job. And you're fine until the next election cycle. And then eventually you win one because you've done your time and you've done what you're supposed to do. That's the system that exists in the United States today. It sounds more like an oligarchy than it does a constitutional republic,
Exactly.
right?
I would like to go back to the chart to make sure that we've gone over all the players.
Sure. So there are a number of players here. Sorry, going back to the Sherloc Big Board. Here we go.
So who do we miss? We missed.
So we missed some of the minor players in the case. Michael Kruger is actually a big player in the case. He's a whistleblower. People can
Okay.
actually hear his testimony. Your regulatory agencies. So in essence, what we just talked about, they're competing for control of cryptocurrency. The CFTC was designated to be the one. They did whatever it took. In Crater's case with My Bitcoin, they suppressed evidence. They suppressed exonerating witnesses. The federal court system was complicit in it in Massachusetts. It's a freaking mess, right? You had Mark Gillespie, who was a promoter, and then you had Adam Tracy, who was the lawyer who set up what was supposed to be an acquisition of My Bitcoin by another publicly traded company that didn't happen, right? But he was also given a pass by the government, magically just gone.
So people getting passes, them doing this case in Massachusetts because they knew that they had liberal judges, right? So they manipulate the entire system.
Right. Massachusetts is a place that the government knows they can go to get a win. And when it comes to crypto, it's almost a slam dunk.
So what's the in conclusion? What do people really need to understand about what's happening today with FTX? And
Sure. So we'll go back to the Sherloc Big Board in a second because we're going to talk CBDC. But ultimately, the government's goal is control, but it's also to pick winners and losers. So they want to make sure that whoever wins in cryptocurrency that the CFTC is regulating is someone handpicked by them so they can control the outcome. Ideally, they want you using one crypto that you thought was independent, but they ultimately control, and they regulate in the United States.
So it all really goes back to what China is doing with the credit score.
Correct.
So they're wanting all of us on this one system so that they can control everything that we're all doing.
And to show you, people say, oh God, that's got to be years away. Well, no.
How many banks are testing the CBDC today?
Here's what's incredibly scary. The midterm elections took place November 8th in the United States, okay? A couple of days after that, there was a summit, the G20, happened in Bali, and the governments of the world signed a pledge for an international vaccine passport, including Joe Biden.
Of course.
Okay. The day after that, 12 major banks and the US government announced a pilot program for central bank digital currency. Back to back.
So did we also read that Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, you have to be on the social credit score to be able to get loans and stuff like that as well?
They want to institute, and the way that they're doing this right now is through something called ESG. environmental, social governance. Now, that's currently being used for businesses in the United States, but that's going to spill over to individuals. So in essence, you won't be able to get a loan from certain agencies if your ESG score or your carbon footprint is too big, or you, like me, you happen to enjoy meat and steak, and now you can't do that, right? And if that score is too low, a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac, which provide the majority of mortgages for working class Americans, you won't be able to get a loan from them.
So they literally squeezing the poor people once again, like forcing us to do at their will.
That is a tried and true method. I mean, we're moving into a segment in history where you have serfdom again, right? They're the elite. They're a very small part of the population, but they control all of the serfs and useless eaters. I mean, it's a very nasty setup, but it's been done before. They're just repeating the playbook and people don't realize it.
So now that we see the playbook, right, we're going to be doing the Asset Summit. So why don't you take a couple minutes to talk about the Asset Summit and why we're doing it and what's it going to be all about?
Let's do a walkthrough of the CBDC first,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
we'll talk about the Asset Summit.
Okay.
So central bank digital currency, right? We were talking about this early on. Imagine that there's no longer paper money. Now, some of this is already happening. You have a check card or whatever, right? It's digital money. But imagine that digital money is your only source. Well, a lot of bad things can happen with that. Imagine the government having central control of your bank account. So they could cut off your money if you're not spending enough money. They could say, well, look, if you don't spend it, we're going to penalize you and take it away until you spend it.
Yeah, I was kind of talking about that before when I said, if you've been a bad boy, you can't go a mile away from your house, right? So that's the kind of behavioral control that they're looking for.
So what we did, because people ask us about this a lot, going back to the Sherloc Big Board here, what we did is we created a diagram to show you what a central bank digital currency would look like. And this utilizes some of what China already does because they're way further ahead with a social credit score. In essence, they're the same thing. It is a centralized means of control. So here's an example that I think everyone can appreciate, right? So you're standing at a red light and you think about crossing, but you don't. So Julianna uses her better judgment and says, I'm not going to cross. Light turns green, Julianna crosses. Well, she then gets an alert on her phone that her social credit score went down because she thought about crossing the street. Not that you did, but you thought about it. You committed a thought crime. Imagine that being central bank digital currency. You had 500 CBDCs. Now you have 480. You're penalized for that. And that thought crime could be anything. You could look at someone the wrong way. You could talk badly about the government, right? Okay, so that happens, right? So you say, listen, I'm going to go and drown my sorrows. I'm going to get some pizza and a beer. Can't spend your money there because Julianna had pizza and beer last week, and you were a bad girl. You thought about crossing on that red light. So no pizza and beer for you. Then you get a call that your dad's sick. Now you live in Shanghai, but your dad's in Hong Kong. So you got to travel. Can't travel. Can't go more than a mile from your house because you thought about crossing on a red light and you wanted pizza and beer when you already have it. That is the future of a central bank digital currency. Complete and utter control. And then when you do something the government doesn't like, because they can track every single transaction and they would control your bank account, they can just cut it off. Just like that. Central bank digital currency is a very, very, very dangerous thing. And they're already testing it. As a matter of fact, the Atlantic Council, which is a liberal think tank nonprofit that's been around forever, actually has a page on their website where they track the progress of central bank digital currencies around the world, how countries are doing in their progress.
Implementing it?
Yes. Where are they at right now with their implementation? This is incredibly scary.
Crazy.
Yeah. So you wanted to talk Asset Summit?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in looking at all of this, we said, look, there's got to be a solution, right? And we look to the parallel economy. You can opt out of the system. And with what exists today, people have the capability to create their own economies and do commerce with each other.
So a parallel economy is another economy that works alongside an economy that's already established. So if we've got fiat currency and we say we don't want to use it anymore, and we go on to this parallel economy and say we're only going to do business in gold and silver, that's a parallel economy?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So we said, great, the parallel economy is amazing. How do we codify that and make it make sense? So what better way to do that than with an asset summit, where we cover all the areas that are most important. So starting in the first quarter of 2023, we're going to run with the asset summit. It'll be just about a full day's worth of training. We'll talk biblical principles of economics.
Nice.
We'll talk about your assets, all of them, right?
Like an asset for the layperson. It could be what? Bullets,
Yeah.
gold and silver,
Land, right? Food, energy, like all of that stuff. Those are all your assets.
Okay.
Your community in and of itself, skills, right? We're going to talk about your assets and how you make them work for you. We'll also talk about relationships. So if you build a parallel economy, how do you work with others who build parallel economies?
Well, in my parallel economy, I'm going to need the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, right? So you need to have all these people in your sphere of influence where you go, you know what, if everything hits the fan later, you know, we can all rely on each other because, you know, we can trade and barter and do what we need to do as a community of people to get the job done.
Absolutely right.
Just like the Amish.
Yep. And notice how the Amish have largely thrived to the point where the government's cracking down on some of the Amish. That tells you everything you need to know. I mean, when's the last time you see anybody crack down on the Amish? They mind their business and they make incredible furniture and their food's really good, but they mind their business. And technology isn't a part
of what they do.
Yet they're doing things right. It's another story for another time. And then we'll pull it all together. So what often happens is people go to summits or they go to conferences, they get all this information and they've got it all over their notebook and then they try to figure out what to do. What we do in the final segment of the day is we help you pull it all together and you walk out of the Asset Summit with a blueprint to create your own parallel economy.
So I'm all about, you know, workbooks, right? Because if I'm not coming to learn something, what am I, you know, doing with my time here? Correct. So, you know, what to's next?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, so the Asset Summit's exciting. Again, we'll do that in first quarter of 2023, and then we'll go on from there. It's going to be a great day of teaching and understanding. So I'm super excited about doing that.
Me too.
All of the research work that we've done, because Sherloc's primary business, we're a market research and competitive intelligence firm, is around this. People come to us and say, what don't I know and what should I do? And so we said, how do we address those questions in an even more meaningful way in a world that's really weaponized against us as people?
Well, we need to know what we need to know. And the thing that we've noticed is that we don't know what we don't know, to the point where Carl Jackson will say, I don't even know what questions to ask you at this point. Well, you know, we need to be educating each other about what's happening.
Absolutely right.
You know, because we need to all be awake and aware of what's going on with our government.
Yeah, so it's a lot to take in and stuff like this, but it's always certainly worth it to break it down and then connect the dots, Julianna. I thought that was a great idea when we talked about doing this episode of Sherloc's Roundtable, where it's like, lay it out for the layperson.
Well, I needed to see it. I needed to understand it. And I wanted to know how that impacted me. And if I can't be the only one that's sitting here going, okay, please simplify this so that I can easily understand it.
Right. Make it make sense.
Make it make sense. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for doing that with me.
Yeah,
I
no problem. High five for us.
Yeah.
Excellent. Guys, thank you for joining us for this edition of Sherloc Exposes. We're excited to do more, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah. Bye, guys.